Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ray. I'm a detransition male, and today I'm going to be reacting to Dr. Z, who is a clinical psychologist who works with transgender adults. And in my personal opinion, Dr. Z is a big promoter of gender identity ideology and obscures the truth about autogynephilia that I think is doing a disservice to these people, these males who have gender dysphoria. And I think she is distorting the true reality of where this gender dysphoria is coming from and giving misleading information that I think is, not informing people about what's really going on with their own gender dysphoria. So I'm going to be reacting to this video called Hidden Signs You Might Be Trans. Expert reveals 4 clues. And it turns out that the 4 clues are actually clues that you're an autogynephile, not that you're trans. Not that they're mutually exclusive. It's just that we have to understand what's the causal origins of what's going on. What is actually happening with this? Okay. So let's watch the video.
Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Z. I'm a clinical psychologist specializing in transgender care. Welcome to my channel. It's wonderful to be here with all of you as always. If you have not yet subscribed to this YouTube channel, please support me and do so. It's really important, especially right now, to support people who create such informative and important content. And if you haven't yet joined me on Instagram, please also do so. That's where I show up daily and offer you tips, guidance, and advice. Having said that, today I'm going to share with you 4 signs that you might be transgender. Now, before we start, let's be very clear that gender is more complex than just clicking off 4 particular signs. Gender is multidimensional, especially when gender is tied to experiencing gender dysphoria and transcendency specifically. There are a lot of nuances on the table. And so for that reason, I want to be very, very clear that while this is a very simplistic way, it is also incredibly beneficial because these 4 signs are 4 signs that I have consistently observed as a pattern over 18 years of my experience working with trans adults. And I'd say more than 85 to 87%, I have seen these 4 signs existing either altogether or in a very least 3 out of 4 in pretty much everybody that I worked with who had gender dysphoria stemming from core identity gender issue and who identified.
Notice how she says gender dysphoria stemming from core identity issue. What does that mean? What is a core identity issue? Does that mean that when you were born, you had this mismatched gender identity in your brain? A lot of people in the transactivist world want to push that narrative, and they sort of use, certain brain studies to sort of support this idea that somehow, transgender people are born with these mismatched brains. And I don't think that's what's actually going on. The evidence, when you really dig into it and critique the methodology of how they do these studies are tracking sexual orientation. They're not tracking gender identity. So a lot of this brain research has, it's very poor methodological design on these studies, and they're not properly controlling for the variables in order to rule out alternative explanations to the gender identity framework. They're using they sort of ignore the relevance of sexual orientation, which, if you did look at that research, as people like Dr. James Cantor have done, then you'll see that these brain studies that sort of, purportedly show that gender identity, that, you're born with this gender identity mismatch. What actually is going on is that it's tracking your sexual orientation. Okay, so I just wanted to preface that because she talks about core identity issues as being the root cause of the gender dysphoria, whereas I want to push for the Blancharddian view, which is that in the case of the autogynephiles and the homosexual transsexuals, is actually your sexuality that is the core, and the identity stuff gets built upon that core sexual drive. I'm not saying there aren't identity issues. It's just that the identity issues are downstream of the more underlying foundational thing that is at the root of the gender dysphoria.
Others trans-femme, trans-masculine, or non-binary. So these 4 signs are really, really important. But again, I just want to remind you that gender is not as simple as checking those 4 sign boxes. I also know that a lot of you are feeling overwhelmed, sometimes very confused, unsure, or maybe you're sure, but you're fearful. And sometimes watching videos like this where somebody who's so specialized is giving you these pattern descriptions can be very helpful in feeling more anchored and more affirmed in your gender identity. So let's get on to the 4 signs. The first sign is this, and that's a very common one, and a lot of you are going to resonate. You are spending tremendous amount of time thinking about your gender. This is going to apply to all psychological types, whether you are anxious, and as a byproduct of being anxious, you're probably going to spend more time ruminating in regards about your gender than anybody else, but it's still going to be present, whether you are depressive type or neurotic type, regardless of your personality structure. You're just spending a lot of time thinking about gender. What is a lot of time thinking about gender? Well, let me give you this contrast. Let me use myself as an example. I am cis and I don't experience gender dysphoria. And do I think about my gender? Yes, I think about my gender role more than anything else. What do I mean by that? I think a lot about what it's like to be a woman in today's world. I think a lot about what it's like to exist on a binary spectrum in this world. I think a lot about the expectations, the stereotypes, and the social constructs that go along to identifying as a woman. So I think more about those roles, and then I think about how those roles may inhibit my potential growth, how they may be actually obstacles for me, for example, in my career, for example, in other areas of my life, how some things that I have learned have created limiting beliefs. That's just how I think about gender. That way of thinking about gender is something that I think a lot of us tend to do because we do live in a world where there's a lot of social pressures and expectations. Now, the difference between me and a lot of you who struggle with gender dysphoria is that I don't wake up and I don't go to sleep thinking about my gender. I don't think throughout the day about my gender identity. I never question my gender identity. I feel incredibly solid, very fixed in my gender identity as a woman. And that's a good example for all of you to think about. People who have gender dysphoria and people who struggle with gender identity issues spend a lot of time, and I would say majority of your daytime, thinking about your gender identity. You're not just thinking about your gender expression or gender role, you're thinking about your core gender, and you're primarily thinking about.
So this is perfectly compatible with the theory of autogynephilia, which is that given that it derives from your underlying inverted heterosexuality, your underlying sexual drive, that is a core part of who you are and is motivating a lot of your thoughts in your day-to-day. And according to the theory of autogynephilia, that underlying desire, that underlying eroticism, that underlying inverted heterosexuality, it leads to a desire to embody femininity. So yes, of course, you're going to be thinking about that desire. You're going to be seeing women and you're going to be envious of them and you're going to want to embody that. You're going to be, you're going to be exposed to all this transgender stuff on the internet, on Reddit, on social media, and you're going to be envious of those trans women and those lives. You're going to be exposed to transgender pornography when you're, on the internet or you're having a masturbation session. So that's going to also stimulate these thoughts. So yes, having thoughts about, your gender is not incompatible with the theory of autogynephilia, particularly when that underlying autogynephilia, when it's anatomical autogynephilia, that's going to motivate a dislike, a autoandrophobia, a dislike of your body. And so, yes, you're going to be thinking about your body. You're going to be thinking about your desires, your embodiment goals. And I'm not saying that you're going to be necessarily like aroused all the time. because the theory of autogynephilia doesn't say that you're in this like constant state of arousal, but nevertheless, insofar as in regular heterosexuality, that underlying sexuality motivates a lot of our behaviors in the day-to-day. It motivates our thoughts, it motivates our motivations, it motivates our desires. Same thing with autogynephilia. It's a core part of our sexuality, and so it's going to influence a lot of our thoughts, a lot of our desires, a lot of our fantasies. We're going to be wrapped up in this. We're going to be having this desire. So thinking about gender all the time, it's it's perfectly compatible with just having this underlying inverted heterosexuality called autogynephilia.
Your discomfort with your gender assigned at birth, your discomfort with your present physicality, you're thinking a lot about that, and you wake up, you go to sleep sometime thinking about it. The only time you may not be thinking about it is when your mind is very distracted, is when your mind is very preoccupied. Let's say you threw yourself completely into work project, and for the short period of time you may not even think about it. Or maybe you are an advent runner, and when you run, you had to go somewhere else completely clears and you're not thinking about it. But other than that, the only, not only, but the time you take for yourself to sit down on a couch, for example, and take a breather, you start thinking about your gender. So that's sign number one. You're spending a lot of time, a lot of preoccupation goes into thinking about your gender identity primarily. Who am I? What does it mean? Why do I feel so uncomfortable? Why is there discomfort? Why do I feel dysphoria? Why do I not like my certain physical characteristics? That's a sign number one. Now, the second sign that may be, sort of precursor that you are either trans or struggling with gender dysphoria is that you are secretly in isolation, engaging in some kind of gender bending behavior. You either feminizing, masculinizing. For a lot of trans femme identified, it will be primarily really a lot of feminizing behavior. Because for a lot of who are trans masculine, it's much easier to present without even being in isolation in a masculine presentation, and nobody's going to bat an eye. But for trans femme clients and non-binary femme, this is going to be a big one, especially for trans femme. You're isolating yourself because you're still feeling a lot of shame and guilt, and you're isolating yourself because you don't want anybody to know. You're not sharing this with anybody else. What does isolation usually looks like for you is this. If you're married, if you're in a relationship, you do it at work. If you have a private office where nobody can see you, you stay at work after hours so you can have office all to yourself. You travel for work, whether you are in a relationship or not, and you do it in a hotel room. You wait for your partner, your wife, your husband, whoever you're in a relationship with, to leave the house because you're working from home, and then you go and you engage in this behavior. It happens in isolation. It gives you tremendous amount of relief. It takes dysphoria from, I would say, feeling for some of you 10 drastically to even 5 or 4. It helps a lot with any kind of distress or tension you feel. So this is a second sign that you may.
Okay, but you have to understand, why do you feel the shame and the guilt? Like, why is the shame? It's because there's a sexual component to this. What she just described was classic autogynephilic fetishistic cross-dressing. These men, when they're going to the hotel room, where they're going on the work trip and they're dressing up, they're not just dressing up. It culminates in an orgasm. And then after the orgasm, you experience post-nut clarity. And that's when the shame kicks in. That's when the guilt kicks in. That's when, that's how your dysphoria gets managed, because you feel the relief. What is the relief? The relief is the dissolution of these overwhelming sexual desires that are motivating this fetishistic cross-dressing. And then when you finally orgasm, you just sort of go back and you sort of like, you get your fix, and then you go back to your regular life. And this is called the binge purge cycle, which is incredibly common, particularly, as you mentioned, for these married men, for these men in relationships. So what she's describing is fetishistic cross-dressing and the binge purge cycle, which is connected to shame, and which is connected to all these things. And it's like, what she's describing is classic autogynephilia. So yes, this is a sign you might be trans, but that's only insofar as autogynephilia is the thing that motivates that eventual trans identification. But what she's describing is like classical autogynephilia, and I find this to be really misleading because she's leaving out all the sexual, like the like sexual nature of these dress up sessions. You can't understand this phenomenon of secretive cross-dressing unless you understand that it's ultimately connected to a masturbation section. You don't it's like very rare that you just dress up on the work trip, and then you never eventually masturbate. And they, yeah, the buildup can last weeks. You sort of build up this pressure and pressure and pressure, but then eventually you orgasm, and then that desire goes away. And yes, you do feel relief. You do feel euphoria. It's like a drug high. It feels incredibly good. It's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly addictive. It's like a powerful dopamine driving circuit because it's connected to novelty and taboo and kink and shame. And that's like a heady concoction that, just creates this incredible feeling of euphoria that drives this behavior. And then eventually the time period between the different binge purge cycles gets increasingly shorter and shorter and shorter. And then eventually you just feel like it comes to a head. And then that's when you fully give in, you fully indulge, you fully escalate. And that's when you transition, when you can't, keep hiding it anymore because like the shame is too much. And then once you start dressing full time, the novelty goes away, the taboo goes away, the shame goes away, and then you full-time transition. But you have to understand the nature of the phenomenon. And she's just completely glossing over the sexual aspect of these secretive fetishistic cross-dressing sessions, which I find that to be incredibly dishonest, and it's misleading, and it's like not giving people accurate information. It's not helping people truly understand what's going on here.
Maybe trans, or you're struggling with gender dysphoria. You are gender bending and you're doing it privately. You're doing it in isolation. And isolation is a significant point here because here's the thing about isolation. A lot of you isolating because there's a part of you that on a deeper level perhaps feels a knowing sense that this is your gender identity. And that brings up a lot of shame and guilt, or a lot of sense of responsibility, or a lot of sense of tremendous amount of fear of how it's going to affect your life. And so this is why it happens in isolation, because you can't even fathom sharing this with anybody else, including people.
It's happening in isolation because it's often connected to masturbation. You don't do this in like in front of your family members. And also we're not mentioning the influence of transgender pornography as well, which is having a huge impact on these. We're not talking about sissy hypno. We're not talking about all of the things that are driving this behavior. So we have to be really clear what we're talking about here.
People who are close to you. So that's a sign number 2. Sign number 3 is a very, very common one, especially for any of you who've been struggling with gender dysphoria for decades. The longer you've been struggling with gender dysphoria and being in touch with the fact that you have gender dysphoria, the more you're going to feel the sign number 3. And that is, you are finding yourself dissociating a lot in relationship to your body. What is dissociation? Dissociation is a psychological coping mechanism. It is a coping mechanism our mind employs when we're going through severe trauma. So that way we don't have to really be present when the trauma happens and isolate ourselves. That's when we have out of the body experience. Dissociation is defense that primarily happens during severe abuse, severe sexual abuse, any kind of severe trauma infliction. And when you spend a long time feeling completely disconnected with your gender assigned at birth, one can say there is also long-term enduring trauma, and as a result, people learn how to dissociate. The reason why people who are trans and struggle with dysphoria learn how to dissociate is because it is incredibly painful and challenging to navigate this world, to navigate this life in a vessel that you don't identify with, in a vessel that everybody out there genders in a way that nowhere even close resembles who you truly are. And for that reason, a lot of people choose to dissociate. I wouldn't say choose, it's not a voluntary response, but your mind starts dissociating as a way of protecting you. Again, dissociation is incredibly common among transgender community. It is a sign of defense. It's a coping mechanism. So if you're finding yourself dissociating a lot, especially this is going to happen a lot anytime you are nude. Maybe you're nude because you just took a shower and you're looking at yourself. Anytime you are intimate with anybody sexually, you may find yourself dissociating a lot because connecting to your body in that moment can be incredibly challenging. So that's a sign number 3.
Okay, so this is also, again, a sign of autogynephilia, because autogynephilia is associated with autoandrophobia, dislike of one's body. Because when you have, for example, an anatomic autogynephilia, a desire to embody the female form, that is correlated with a dislike, a repulsive disgust of your male body, a disgust of everything associated with masculinity. And also on the behavioral autogynephilia component, you have a desire to be treated, to behave as if one was a woman. And this includes being treated as a woman in sex. And so your deepest sexual drive is often to be more submissive, to be the bottom in the bedroom. But if you're a married straight man and in a relationship with a heterosexual woman, there's often the expectation that you are playing the more traditional masculine role in that relationship. And so that's going to cause you to sort of check out, to become self-conscious, to dissociate. You're not going to be fully in the moment. You're going to be in your head. You're going to be questioning that. You're going to be, sort of have performance anxiety. That's very common with autogynephiles because, you're not fully on board with that masculine role because your sexuality is determined by that underlying desire to embody the feminine role. You want to, like, your sexual fantasy is to be in the feminine role in the relationship. So yes, this is going to cause conflict and dissociation and in sex. And also, you're going to look at your male body. That's because of the autoangiophobia. That's going to create disgust and repulsiveness. And also, given that you can't embody your desires for femininity, that's also going to lead to dysphoria. So it's this interplay between euphoria and dysphoria, which is fully compatible with the theory of autogynephilia.
Now, the final 4 signs that forms this pattern, this quad, I would say, of 4 signs that I see a lot, that is an indicator, a good indicator that you might be trans or you might struggle with dysphoria, is you experiencing a lot of gender envy. I did a video on gender envy. I actually did a video also on dissociation. I think I did a video on pretty much everything under the sun. So make sure you look through the video library. Gender envy is when you're looking at other people and you envying their gender representation, you envying their gender identity. And one of the reasons why you envy it is because you see a resemblance of your inner desires. You see a mirroring back effect of your inner truth in another person. And that creates and breeds envy. Gender, one can say, is gender envy common among, for example, people with no dysphoria? I would say it's not so much gender per se envy. For example, I may look at another woman and find some aspects of her very beautiful and desire those aspects, but it's less, I would say, I'm envying her identity as a woman. I'm envying more certain characteristics. So there's the difference to that. Gender envy is very common. A lot of people struggle with that. Anytime you find yourself, and it can be also very subtle, by the way, anytime you find yourself out dining, having a lunch out with a friend, and you look over at somebody and suddenly you feel like everything inside of you just dropped. You feel this shallow effect inside of you. You look at them and you feel tremendous sadness and disappointment towards yourself. And you so badly want to be that gender identity. You so badly want to be just like that person. just like that girl or a woman or a man or anybody who might be even non-binary gender bending, you look at it and there's a strong, strong desire. You're almost jealous. You have this inclination to imagine yourself as that person. That's, my friends, gender envy. So these are the four.
So what she just described was the most classical description of autogynephilia that you could possibly imagine, which is that you are attracted to femininity, you're attracted to women, you're attracted to the female form, but you also are envious and jealous of femininity and women and the female form. So this is the classic envy desire duality, which is at the heart of auto heterosexuality. So this is, again, fully compatible with the theory of auto heterosexuality, the theory of autogynephilia, such that, it's based on an inverted heterosexuality. So you have a heterosexual orientation towards being attracted to the opposite sex, but you're also envious of the opposite sex. But crucially, you don't see this in the homosexual type. You don't see that sort of like attraction, envy, desire sort of like relationship in the homosexual type. So you only see this in the trans women who are heterosexual. They're attracted to women, because that's where the confusion comes in. You get confused. You're like, am I attracted to that person, or do I want to be that person? And it's that confusion that leads to the subsequent escalation and manifestation of the trans identification, and it comes out of this envy desire relationship. So basically, in this entire video, she's talking about these, signs you might be trans, and it's like, no, there's signs that you are an autogynephile, as signs that you have auto heterosexuality. Now, I'm not saying that if you are of the autogynephilic type that you can't be trans, because autogynephilia is a common pathway, a common causal origin of trans identification. But we have to get the order of operations here clear. We have to get the causal story clear, which is that the underlying autogynephilic predisposing factor comes first, and then the trans identification comes later. And also, the trans identification is not a necessary entailment of having these feelings. You can have these feelings, you can have these desires, and depending on the severity of them, you may or may not choose that, going down a certain transition pathway or getting certain medical interventions may or may not be the right pathway for you if you are a rational, informed adult. But people are not being informed of what the actual condition is. They're just being told that you have core identity issues. Well, where does the identity issues come from? They come from this inverted heterosexuality. They come from this innate predisposing factor that gets, influenced by environmental conditions. So this gender psychologist is, I think, misleading people. And this is a part and parcel of this broader phenomenon within the trans world of egg culture, of like all these clues that you may be an egg, when in reality, actually what their clues are the fact that you have this unusual sexuality, this unusual inverted heterosexuality that is the causal origin of the vast majority of gender dysphoria in the Western world. So okay, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.